want to note that we will be recording, so I didn't make a mention of that earlier in the call. So we can, folks can view this again later. Just to review the agenda here, we're going to head into discussing about the Upland sampling plan being presented by Dwight at the port. And then following that, we'll be discussing community sampling events, some planning efforts, and receiving some updates and an opportunity to provide some input. And that will be co-led by Elizabeth Kennedy Wong and Mama Long with PHCC and Jessica Terlikowski. And then following that, we'll discuss the in-water projects. So GSI, Josh Bale, as well as Barbara with the Oregon Department of State Lands will be providing updates there with Jessica T. And then we will head out with some next steps and adjourn. But before we do a deep dive there, I just wanted to note that we do have some vacancies from the community end on our executive committee. So good news for Alex, who with PHCC is taking a position working for the state now in the geology department. So our loss, but his gain, and I think hopefully we'll continue to see him in the future where things overlap or intersect. And we also see some transitions with as well with Heather, who's now heading over, correct me if I'm wrong here, the new organization going from Willamette River Keepers, and now will be with, what's the?
Columbia Slough Watershed Council.
Thank you, Columbia Slough. So just want to note that on an ad hoc basis, she will be continuing on and will be providing updates. But if there's anyone here on the community who's interested, please plop your interest on the chat box. And if you can just leave your contact information as well, I'll be happy to talk from community, just what the experience has been working, providing the committee. But again, the role of the committee, Elizabeth just shared a link, again, is helping craft the agenda and helping steer many of our conversations here. So really hoping for just new opportunities for community leadership to step up here on the Willamette Cove space, but expect me to bug you down the road. I don't know if there's any questions or anything I missed, Elizabeth or Jessica T, anything either of you would add, or anyone from the exec committee?
Just that I think there's 2 positions at least for community members. And I think it's a very straightforward, just tell Rand Feast that you're interested, and he'll get back to you and talk to you more about it. And we did put kind of the work description in the chat, and yeah. It's a good opportunity to see kind of how this conversation is shaped and what comes forward from it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. With that, we will transition now for the Upland sampling plan, and I'll kick it off to Dwight.
Thanks, Renfeast. Herb, if you want to pull up or share your screen so we can pull up the presentation, and I'll continue with our introductions here. Thanks again, everyone, for being here today. This presentation will cover the approach and methodology for the sampling work that we're planning to do at the Willamette Cove Upland. The Port and Metro developed this sampling plan and submitted it to DEQ on February 23rd. DEQ's role in this is to review the submitted plan, ensure it meets the objectives for determining the location and the extent of contaminants of concern. The information collected during the sampling then will help us inform the remedial design for the final remedy of the upland. DEQ has shared this plan on their websites. They've also sent copies out to the Willamette Cove Working Group and others. And DEQ has agreed to receive public feedback on the sampling plan, and will address that feedback prior to finalizing the plan. We're happy to present this approach to the sampling work today. We will make sure that DEQ gets any feedback or comments from this discussion today. And we should have ample time at the end of the presentation for any questions or comments. So, feel free to raise questions as we go, or preferably at the end. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Herb Clough from Apex Companies, who is our consultant for the Upland work at Willamette Cove. Herb.
All right, thanks. Now, is anything sharing at this point?
Not seeing it yet.
I may have technical difficulties because it's not allowing me to click the share button.
Sometimes if you're the host, you have to go to the security button and allow others to share.
Yeah. Alyssa, can you help make sure that Herb can do this?
Yeah, I just gave him capabilities. He should be able to share now.
Thank you.
Yeah, the share button is not lighting up yet. I will try again.
Or maybe you can email it to some of us and we can post it for you.
How about if I try sharing here?
Are the settings such that participants can share, not just the host? Whoever organized the meeting would need to adjust that.
Both Dwight and Herb should be able to share at this point. They both have co-host capabilities, so I'm seeing Elizabeth is sharing her screen.
Perfect.
There it is.
There we go.
Okay, sorry for that. All right, so excuse me. So what I would like to do today is I recognize that we have a very diverse audience here, so I'm going to try to walk that fine line between providing enough information for people to understand what's going on versus boring those that may understand some of the jargon and so forth. As Dwight said, there should be opportunity for questions at the end. So if I do say something that I don't explain to your satisfaction, please do note that for questions. I do want to try to keep moving through. There's a lot of stuff here. So if we could go to the next slide. So overall, what we're trying to do today is talk about a few things that really lead us into why we're doing what we're doing out there in terms of the sampling that's going to be done for design. We're going to talk a bit about what the remedy is and how that plays into the design. We want to talk a bit about why we're collecting additional data, what's missing, what are we trying to address, and then a few details about the actual sampling itself, how we do it, and then what we do with that information. We're also going to talk a little bit about how we're going to staff it, things like that. So as far as the goals here, the overall objective is to define where the COCs are above cleanup levels and where the COCs are above hotspot levels. Now, already there's some jargon. So what do these terms mean? COC is just an acronym for Contaminants of Concern. And how did we define those? Ultimately, it's a chemical or a metal that's determined to be above a cleanup level at the site. The COCs were determined through prior site history, the remedial investigation that's gone on over the years, and then the sampling that was done. And that was then used to define these COCs, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. With respect to the cleanup level, that is the concentration below which the risk is acceptable. What does that mean? Ultimately, that's determined through various scientific investigations and so forth. But ultimately, what it really is saying is where there's no observed impacts to receptors or the impacts are indistinguishable from background. it gets very complicated because some impacts can be immediate, some can be long-term, such as cancer, and trying to figure out how those impact determining an acceptable level is a complicated process that we don't need to get into here. But ultimately, that's the concentration that's determined to be okay. That's the cleanup level. And then the third term that I used there was hotspot level. Ultimately, that is just a high concentration of a COC. In this case, under DEQ rules, it's generally 10 to 100 times the cleanup level, depending upon a number of factors such as what the receptor is and what the COC is. So those go into determining what that is. The sole purpose of the hotspot level, as defined here, is under DEQ rules. It's used to define the level at which there's a preference for removal or treatment. It's important to remember that this 10 times factor or 100 times factor is arbitrary. There's really no substantive difference between the impacts at 9.9 times the cleanup level versus 10.1 times the cleanup level. Those are effectively the same. So nothing magic happens at that 10 times or that 100 times. It was essentially an arbitrary level to decide what is high for purposes of the evaluation at the feasibility study stage of whether or not there's a preference for treatment or removal. Both cleanup levels and hotspot levels vary by a number of factors. So the receptor, whether it's a human, ecological receptors, there are differences. So for humans, for instance, whether it's a resident, somebody that lives there, a worker, a construction worker, a child, a visitor, all of those factors go into determining those numbers. Then the ecological is a catch-all for plants and animals. And again, mobile animals such as mammals and birds, they have a wide range, so that affects how you determine these various levels. Immobile receptors, plants, invertebrates, think worms, they don't move or they don't move very far. So again, all of that type of information goes into determining what these cleanup levels and hotspot levels are. Other factors that go into that are pathways, how are they exposed? So all of that goes into that, and because of that, it affects how long something is exposed to the COC. For instance, somebody that lives on a site may be exposed for years. Somebody that just visits might be a very short period of time. All of that has to go into that. So one important factor about all of these potential factors that affect these cleanup levels and so forth, and what we need to investigate is the depth of contaminated soil. In this case, at Willamette Cove, the contaminated soil is essentially confined to the 0 to 3 foot level. The reason for that being that, with few exceptions, most of the sensitive receptors, again, think children, residents, burrowing animals, plants, are really only mucking about in that top 3 feet. And so as a result, the cleanup level for those sensitive receptors really only applies to the upper few feet. And in this case, DEQ generally defines that surface soil to be the 0 to 3 foot level. So it doesn't necessarily mean there isn't some contamination below 3 feet, but the receptors at these more sensitive cleanup levels are only exposed to that soil. And the deeper soils that have been sampled have been shown to be acceptable for the receptors that could go that deep. Okay, next slide, please. So just as by way of background, then the main components of the selective remedy is, from a very high level, remove hotspots to an offsite landfill, consolidate and cap the moderately contaminated soil, and then cover in place any remaining soil that's above risk levels. So that's the high level. The details, of course, it gets more complicated than that. The hotspot removal does not include dioxin furan ecological hotspots. Now, the reason for that, there are several reasons, but one of the primary reasons is for human health, the dioxin furan hotspot level is based on a 100 times. For ecological, it's only 10 times. And so it turns out that the concentrations we have out there that are widespread generally fall between that 10 times and 100 times level. And so although we've removed hotspots to address human health, that same concentration is still a hotspot for eco. Secondly, those levels are relatively widespread, and the cleanup levels we're talking about are so relatively low that they are widespread, and the practicability issue comes into play of whether or not the preference for removal or treatment of hotspots can come into play. It's a preference, not a mandate. And so as a result of following the processes through the feasibility study and remedy selection, the practicability issue of removing all of those hotspots comes into play. So when we say we're removing the hotspots for offsite disposal, we're really talking about every hotspot but the dioxin furan hotspots associated with ecological receptors. Now, that said, the second step comes in, consolidate and cap. So everything else that's on site that's still either an ecological hotspot or relatively higher, or human health cleanup levels, all of that material would then be consolidated in one location on site and an engineered cap placed over that. The key points for this step, the second step of the remedy, is at that point, all of the human health risk on the site is acceptable, and there would be no restrictions in terms of human access, use of the site, except those related to disturbance of the cap on the consolidated cell. That would be the only place where there'd be any kind of restriction, and essentially the only substantive restriction would be with respect to site use would be you couldn't go out there and dig holes, as an example. There would be no hotspots remaining on site because either they've been removed or because the limited eco hotspot material would be under a 3-foot cap, which is now below the surface soil, and therefore would no longer be a hotspot with respect to the 10 times the eco risk, because those eco receptors could not be exposed to that material because it's lower than 3 feet. After this step 2, before the final cover, the remaining risks on site would generally be on the order of 3 times the eco risk levels or less. And that's simply a result of, by going out and removing the soils that exceed human health cleanup levels and consolidating that, you're actually also getting most of the soil that has any kind of substantive eco risk. So after step 2, the site is almost clean. And so lastly, then the third step there is to place some clean cover soils. And it's important to understand that that's not a cap. This is just some cover soils, because essentially over time, what would happen is there would be some continued limited degradation of organic chemicals, but natural mixing that occurs. The amount of clean material that would be put there would be calculated such that when the natural mixing would over time then result in the eco levels being acceptable everywhere. Next slide, please. So these next 2 slides are just a quick summary of where we are right now. And it's not important that you can read this, because I'll just kind of hit a couple of highlight points here. Basically, what the legend is saying is if the colors that you see, the shading and the cross hatching, is kind of dull, that means that's exceeding a cleanup level. If you see a bright color, that's exceeding a hotspot level. So the key takeaway here is the removal actions that have been done out there already have essentially removed all of the human health hotspots. The only bright color you see is this very tiny spot towards the left there. And that's a very small, yep, perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. That's a very small area that we couldn't remove during the removal action for not technical reasons, really related to permitting. It was too close to the riverbank, the top of the bank. Otherwise, it too would have been gone. So the human health hotspots have already been removed. If we then, and then the other thing to note is that if you look at the west parcel, you'll see that cross hatching covers the entire parcel, saying we have unacceptable human health risk in the west parcel. The reason it covers the entire parcel is because some of our historical sampling is essentially a large composite sample that represents the whole west parcel. And so it's unacceptable. We don't know exactly where the higher concentrations are because it's essentially an average of the whole parcel. And so we've identified that entire parcel. The reality is it probably isn't the whole parcel. That's what one of the things we're going to determine with our additional sampling. If we go to the next slide, we see the same summary for eco risk. Now you'll notice here a lot of bright colors, right? So on the human health, it was all dull. On the eco, it's very bright. The reason being is we still have a lot of ecological hotspots out here. And again, the primary reason for that is twofold. One is the bright blue you see there are metals. So there's some hotspots for metals. Ecological receptors tend to be much more sensitive to metals than humans. So concentrations that would be not a risk or very low risk to humans will show up as hotspots for eco. So that's one reason. Another reason is the difference between the 100 and 10-fold for some chemicals. So for some of the chemicals, the human health is at 100 and the eco is at 10. So that comes into play as well. And again, you'll see the same kind of issue with the eco that we saw with the human, that there are some areas of the site that are represented by relatively large average samples as opposed to more specific. So the west parcel again lights up because it's essentially one sample. The east parcel is actually similarly for the green you see there is related to dioxins. And again, it's one large composite sample that represents the whole parcel. So one of the things that we'll try to address. Next slide, please. So what's the basis for what we're laying out and why we're doing what we're doing out there? First off, we're interested in that 0 to 3 foot depth range. Why is that? We talked a bit about that before. That's where the unacceptable risk is. Again, it sounds a little arbitrary, but ultimately it's because that's where the sensitive receptors are exposed to primarily surface soil. That's defined as the upper 3 feet. So that's where the unacceptable risk lies. The next really the big need out here is what we would call representative concentrations, right? What does that mean? We have different kinds of receptors out there. Some of them are wanderers. Think of hikers on the human side or hunters on the eco side. So hawks, coyotes, they don't just stay in one spot, they wander around. So they get exposed to a wide range of area. And so when we think about what's the representative concentration for those receptors, it needs to represent that larger area. Other receptors, the kind of the stay puts, we talked about plants and worms, they don't go anywhere, or they go very, very limited range. We need to know what the concentration is at very small areas to address what the representative concentration would be there. A plant doesn't move anywhere else, so what's the concentration where that plant is? So the design, the sampling design has to account for the fact that some of the things we want to look at is what's going on the whole site or a subsection of the site. Some of the information we need is much more focused than that. So there's a number of ways we can do that. Historically, of course, we talked about composite samples. You can go out and say, oh, I'm going to collect several samples over a wide range here, mix those together and get one result. You can take multiple samples, analyze each sample, and then mathematically look at something that would give you a representative concentration, whether that be an average or some other statistical evaluation of that. All of that's been done in the past. And could be done in the future. One of the, where we are right now in terms of the best science is a movement toward what's called an incremental sampling methodology, or ISM. So you'll hear that term a lot, that acronym, and you see that on this slide. And essentially what that is a large composite sample. And there's some criteria on how to do that to increase the chances that you're going to get a representative sample in terms of how you process it. So how many subsamples you collect, how you handle them, how you prep it before you do the analysis. So it's simply a way to physically average the sample as opposed to mathematically averaging lots of samples. It has advantages in terms of a lot less cost for analytical, but it's a lot potentially more expensive on the sample collection side. And so this is not simply a way to do things cheaper. It is an effort to find the best way to get the best data, the most representative data, but also in a practical way. But going back to what we talked about in terms of representing a sample that represents the type of receptor, we really need what would be call a point sample in quotes there for these receptors that don't move around. The problem in concept with a point sample is if I go out and just take a sample right here and take grab a little jar full of it and go and analyze that, I might, if the contamination is spotty, I might miss it. Or if it's just got a little piece of metal in there and I analyze that, I may get a very high metal concentration, but it's not really available to the receptor. So a single grab sample can be very misleading. In the past, how we've addressed that is we would collect lots of those and then average those or something like that. What the incremental sampling methodology does is improves on that through the how many samples we collect and how we process, as I talked about before, plus some additional sampling replicates that I'll talk about in a second, that allow us to use statistical rules to determine whether or not, in fact, we expect the sample to really be representative. And so what we really need is a mix of samples that cover large areas and samples that cover small. And so what DEQ is at this point is settled on an ISM sample that's collected over an area of a ½ acre or smaller is representative of a point sample, if you will, for evaluation of hotspots or evaluation of receptors that can't or don't move very far. And then samples over larger areas can either be a larger ISM sample or some mathematical evaluation of multiple ISM samples. And so in this case, what we're going to be doing is that latter, and I'll cover that here shortly.
Here, I just want to note we have less than 14 minutes, so just wanted to give you a warning and just make sure we have enough time for some questions and answers.
Absolutely. So there's a few other details. There's some areas that aren't quite conducive to ISM sampling under an old slab on the west parcel and so forth. We're not expecting a lot of impact. So we've got a few places where we'll do some discrete sampling, but the primary sampling will be the ISM sampling. So essentially, if we can go to the next slide, then kind of the summary of what we're doing is we're going to divide the entire site into ½ acre parcels. We're going to go out and collect an ISM sample at each of these. Those individual ½ acres will effectively be our point samples for evaluating the receptors that can't move, and then the multiples of those would be used. We would combine several of those to potentially evaluate other receptors. And we are going to look at the top 3 feet by dividing that up into depth ranges of 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. In each of those, we'll go out and collect 30 grab samples within that ½ acre, same mass, put them in a jar, that'll get processed in 1 sample. So in this ½ acre site, top 1 foot, there'll be 1 sample that is based on 30 increments. 1 to 2 feet, the same thing. 2 to 3 feet, the same thing. I talked about replicates. What the replicates allow us to do is we'll go out and we'll sample the same place 3 times. It won't be, we'll collect a sample and split it. We'll go out, we'll take 30 samples, and that goes in a jar. We'll go right back, right there, and we'll do that again, and then we'll do it a 3rd time. And what that allows us to do, and we're going to do that for 20% of the samples, we will then be able to statistically evaluate, do these results actually represent what we're trying to get? when you put that all together, it's going to be over 4,000 individual samples that'll can be combined into, 144 samples will be analyzed. Of those, 102 will be the data. The other 40 will be the replicates for evaluating that we in fact have representative data. All right, next slide gives us a picture of what that looks like. So what you see here is the sampling units we've laid out. You'll see on the west and east ends, it's very rectangular because we don't have a lot of data there. And so we're just sort of systematically marching across it. In the middle there, you see some very odd shaped parcels. And the reason for that is we have historical data. And you can see we've laid over that the ecological risk summary. And you can see we've sort of tried to mirror how those are laid out there. The idea being that we only want to remove places that have higher contamination, and we don't want to those that are lower. And so we've attempted to set our units up so that we will identify those and only address those areas that need to be addressed. Now, we may find that some of these areas that we didn't think were a problem are, and that's okay. That's what the sampling is for. All right, next slide. There's just a few photographs showing what this looks like. So literally we go out with a small coring device. It typically is going to be pushed into the ground. What we have to do is make sure that we're getting consistent size samples at each of these increments so that each increment equally contributes to the overall sample. We'll get 30 of these in the 0 to 1 foot, 30 of these in the 1 to 2, 30 in the 2 to 3. If we can't push by hand, we'll be using mechanical equipment to get us to the depth. So we might go and collect the surface by hand. We may have to then excavate to 1 foot, collect from 1 to 2 by hand, and so on. And we'll use various tools to do that, whether that be hand auger, powered excavators, vacuum extraction, et cetera. And it may be combinations of all of those. But ultimately, each sample that's collected will be the same size so that we get representative samples. All right, next slide.
Sorry, we have less than 10 minutes. I know there's some questions. Any top level items you want to share? And I imagine we'll have access to the PowerPoint slides that you can share with the group.
Here's the COCs we're going to analyze for it. Again, those were, in fact, based on the site history and the prior sampling. So these are all of the COCs that exceeded risk levels at least once. So we're looking for all of those. Next slide, please. Just want to emphasize that we're looking to, we'll have teams of samplers out there, and we are intending to hire some local folks, train them on environmental technician, get them the training required for safety purposes, medical clearance. We'll do on-the-job training, provide their protective equipment, and after this 2-month stint, the folks that go through this program will be really qualified to be hired as an environmental technician, really for any environmental company. Next slide, please. Been doing outreach. This meeting, DEQ is done, shared through to various groups with the community, with the tribes, and a community event is planned for during the sampling. And lastly is just a quick overview of the schedule. We hope to have an approved work plan next month. And then do the sampling this spring and summer. This will be the first phase of the design. Following would be the work plan, design plans and specs that ultimately leads to the remedial action. That schedule for the remedial action is really controlled by the in-water schedule, because these really have to be implemented hand in hand, because riverbank work will impact Upland and Upland will impact the riverbank and so forth. And that's it.
Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Dwight. And then Elizabeth, do you want to sort of facilitate the question portion here? You are on mute. Still on mute, Elizabeth. I can read out the questions here.
Okay, I got it.
Perfect.
I got it. I had to unmute. I had to quit sharing screens. It was a lot of things all at once. Okay, so there's a couple questions, and then Doug will get to your question. Okay. So the first one was, how do you account for what I believe is bioaccumulation? So how do you account for things that, or contaminants that don't ever leave the system, but basically grow and grow and grow within plants or animals? And then,
Right. So, okay, go ahead.
Wait,
and then-
can I clarify, Elizabeth?
Sure.
Was that the one from me or
Yes,
a different one?
that was yours.
Okay, yeah, no, not so much. Yeah, just kind of the overlapping impacts on people in the environment. So, you know, dioxins is one, and then
Yeah.
PCBs is another. Yeah,
I wasn't quite done.
sorry about that.
No worries. So it was kind of a two-part question. One was a little bit about bioaccumulation, and then the second was about increased risk to exposure of multiple different chemicals.
Right. So both of those factors are taken into account when cleanup levels are determined, right? And so as an example, if you've got dioxins and PCBs, those can have very similar actions. And in the development of the cleanup levels, it considers both the individual action, but then also the collective action of the group. And all of that is factored into the DEQ's rules on risk assessment and the cleanup level determination. Both in terms of bioaccumulation and action of multiple chemicals.
So if I were to take a stab at translating, what you're saying is that the data that you gather provides information on those factors, and then DEQ uses that data to determine how to design the cleanup.
I mean, ultimately, the cleanup levels that we are going to have been established by DEQ, taking into account all of those considerations in terms of bioaccumulation, multiple chemicals. Yes.
Great. So the next question is similar, which is how are treatment levels determined and how are hotspots defined? Is that fair, Ranfis?
Yeah, so the cleanup levels are follow DEQ's rules that ultimately come back to excess cancer risk 1 in a million or less, and for non-cancer it's based on impacts, right? So ultimately it would be whether it be just no observable impacts or something essentially like that. It depends on the receptor. So those have all been established based on the science, whether it be studies of actual exposures, animal studies, et cetera, that all go into establishing what is an acceptable cleanup level. Those are all established by the agencies based on the research that's out there. Once that's level, then the hotspot levels are, like I say, an arbitrary multiple of that, either 10 or 100 times, depending. So for instance, human health, cancer-causing chemicals, it's 100 times is the hotspot. For non-cancer and eco, it's 10 times.
Thank you. And then there's another question that was, are the current reports for available for the current conditions on the site? And I'm going to assume that the corollary question would be, once this is all done and the reports are out, will those also be available?
So the general answer is yes. Would somebody from, I guess, DEQ weigh in on the process for those availability?
Yeah, so this is Erin. So we have 2 websites for this project. One's called our Environmental Cleanup Site Information database. When we sent out the work plan for the uplands, we had a link to both of those websites. So one does keeps a repository of documents. I was just looking, the risk assessment report itself is not there, but all the remedial investigation reports are there. I can try to get the human health and the ecological risk assessment reports up there if folks want to review them. And then any future reports will also be there.
And Erin, Oh,
Yes.
can you put the link in the chat for
Yes, I
folks?
will.
Thank you. Were you gonna say something else?
Oh, just some of the earlier reports we don't have electronically, so sometimes they've been scanned. So that's why some of the older reports aren't as easily they're not as easy to post as new technology that we have now.
Okay, Doug, do you wanna go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I'm a little uncomfortable with your underlying premise that 3 feet and below is protective. Love Canal was basically filled in and graded and had a subdivision put on top of it. And presumably to fill it in, they brought in clean material. So the whole Superfund concept kind of got started with all the cancer that came out of Love Canal from chemicals and biohazards that were below that 3-foot level. So could you address that? Maybe we could
absolutely.
do a third of the test, 6 or 8 feet down.
Right. So a couple things. One is that there is data from below 3 feet. So don't get me wrong. It's not like there isn't any data. So we do have data below that shows that concentrations decrease a lot as we go deeper. Now there are some places like some fill on the west parcel where there are some, there's certainly impacts down to 20, 30, 40 feet. The concentrations down there tend to be lower, but the other issue is how do those chemicals get to us, right? We either need to be down there at that depth against the soil. It needs to transport through vapors that we can be exposed to, through groundwater that we then get exposed to the river, et cetera, right? So there has to be a way for it to get to us. The investigations included groundwater sampling, and the concentrations in the groundwater based on the ability of people to contact that are okay. There's still it's still open whether or not there are eco impacts to the river that are being addressed as part of the ongoing studies. So ultimately, the conclusions based on the data that we, the sum total of the data we've collected, is that the only exposure pathway that is complete with respect to soil on the site is direct contact, right? Not breathing, we're not drinking the water's too deep for eco to get to, et cetera, right? So once we've established that the only pathway at this site, now keeping in mind, this is different than other sites, every site's different. The only pathway is for us to be touching or eating the soil or breathing the dust, all right? That's what we talk about as direct contact. Once we've come to that conclusion, then the question is, are we digging into it? No, because you aren't a construction worker, you're a park visitor. So the park visitor is not going to be digging deeper than 3 feet. Typical burrowing animal is going to be something walking across the site. So that's why we're saying the only risk is associated with the upper 3 feet is A, the concentrations deeper typically are much lower, and B, the receptors that are going about on the site are only being exposed to the surface soil. The reality is they're probably exposed only to the upper few inches for most receptors, but we conservatively go to 3 feet for evaluating what is surface soil.
So a couple of issues. There's been a lot of soil movement around the site over the history as buildings have been torn down and the site's been graded. Is there any concern about hidden hot spots just below that 3 feet?
Well,
as you said, you think it's only surface contamination, but history shows that the surface can be disturbed. It also shows that the science isn't complete. The Love Canal houses were built on top of that 3 feet of soil and people got really sick.
because there was other ways for those chemicals to get to those people, not just touching the soil, whether that be
Do you have
vapors or.
any thoughts on how the two sites are different?
Sorry, Doug and Herb, we're kind of 4 minutes over on this topic. I do want to make sure we get to the other agenda items. If it's okay with folks, I'd love to make sure this conversation continues. So Doug and Herb, I want to make sure that we connect and have this conversation afterwards. And if anyone's interested, definitely want to provide an invitation because I think this is a really important discussion. Doug, please don't take this as.
There will be other opportunities. That's okay.
Thank you, Doug, for those key critical questions. I'm sure everyone's really interested in these. And I just want to thank Herb and Dwight again on this, on the presentation and joining us. And hopefully Herb, you'll join us for future meetings. But I do want to transition us here to the next topic on community sampling. So event planning. So I do want to transition and kick it off to Elizabeth, Jessica, and Mama Long on this topic. So I'll kick it back to you, Elizabeth, and Jessica T. and Mama
Long. Thanks. So the last slide that you saw talked a little bit about the community engagement opportunities. And Jessica and Mama Long and myself have been talking. One thing that I do want to also highlight again is that we do have an opportunity to hire some temporary positions. I think you mentioned them in the presentation. They do come with this certification. They come with personal protective equipment, and there's some other things that they come with. I'm going to put the description of the positions and how to apply for them in the chat. And then the two other things I think we wanted to talk about, and Jessica and Mama Long, you all helped me with remembering those things. One was the organizing of a community event at a park that is above a bluff above Willamette Cove. It gives you a really nice view in almost the view that's behind Jessica right now, but not quite as far away. But a view down into the bluff. And from there, you could actually see how the site is being gridded off for the sampling. Our hope is that we will be both doing the upland sampling of the soils and the in-water sampling that will be happening. So people, and then the idea is that we'll actually be able to bring some of the tools and the samples up to the park site so that people can actually see and understand and kind of play with some of the equipment, and not play with literally, but really understand what the work is that's happening down below on the site. So at this particular moment, we're planning for these events to be, the upland sampling will already have begun and probably be underway for at least a month, but then the in-water sampling will just be started. So we're trying to create one event so you can come and understand everything that's happening. And it'll probably be, it's looking like June. I keep trying to make it earlier. Jessica's like, no, it has to be later. So, so with that, I will give it to Jessica and Mama Long to fill in further details.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. This is Mamela. I'm with the Portland Harbor Community Coalition. So just to give a bit more context and background, at the end of last year, at the last working group meeting, Jessica made a call to folks to see if we'd be interested in brainstorming ideas for a community engagement event related to the upland and in-water sampling. And so I have had some capacity and have been engaging in conversations with both Jessica and Elizabeth to brainstorm some ideas for what this community engagement event could look like that will incorporate and shed light on the sampling. And so we kind of reflected and drew inspiration from the successful Cathedral Park sampling event that happened last fall, I think. And we've been meeting to discuss some objectives, outcomes, who the audience would be, and how we're going to tailor this event to different audiences, and what kind of activities could be taking place as the sampling is happening for community members to just be part of this conversation and see what's going on. And so in some of the brainstorming sessions that we've had, we've come up with a couple of objectives to ensure the focus and the purpose of this event. So first and foremost, it would be really to increase community understanding of the Portland Harbor Superfund site in general, but then more specifically, give people information about Willamette Cove as a project area, including giving people information about the history, the contaminants that are present, and how they impact like the ecology and human health, telling people like what is being sampled and why as it's being sampled, and then also giving people information about what's going to be happening next in the process. Within this, we'll also be sharing some how like community priorities and participations have informed the remedy design. And since it will be the summer, we want to take advantage of the fact that there are a lot of youth camps that will be happening. And so this could also be an opportunity to open this event up to youth and students to get information about environmental cleanup careers, and of course, to really get more people within the community outside of this space to join this group and continue these conversations and give input into this process. And so some of the things we're hoping to achieve is, first and foremost, to increase community participation within this group, and then increase community understanding, trust, and confidence in the sampling efforts, the cleanup process, and the upland and water coordination. And in a way, we're also trying to strengthen relationships between community members and performing parties through this by keeping things open and transparent. And then engaging youth and students of like the awareness of environmental remediation careers. So there are a lot of different people that this will be tailored toward. So some of like the members within like the audience include neighbors. So there'll be people walking around within the park that this will be held in, and they can come up to the table and kind of just see what's going on. And then the usual suspects, which are folks in this room right now. So people within like the Portland Harbor community stakeholders, like North Portland neighborhood associations, people in this group, and people in the collaborative as a whole. And then we've also identified this as something of potential interest to trade and college students and professors who are focused on environmental sciences, studies, or engineering. And then again, just taking advantage of the fact that there are going to be some youth summer camps that will be happening over the summer, and this could be something that they'd be interested in. And so some of the activities that we have brainstormed would be to have like a Portland Harbor and Willamette Cove 101. This is for the day of the event. So having like a Portland Harbor, Willamette Cove 101, something similar to what happens before this meeting, just to give people some information about like the history, the different parties, the cleanup process, what's happening right now and what's going to be happening next, and the role, illuminating on the role of community and remedial design process and in the process as a whole, and giving people information to plug into this and become a part of it. We also have got some opportunities to do some GSI sonic co-processing demonstration and discussion. And this would just be like a single event on the day, which would last approximately 2 hours, which would include a live narrated demonstration of the decontamination process, and then also having like a video available for people to see of the cores being processed. So one of the things I really like about this event is really demystifying the process of the sampling and like being transparent with people about what's happening, how it's happening. And Elizabeth mentioned earlier, having some of the equipment there for people to be able to look at, play with, not really play with, but just see and interact with, just so that it doesn't feel like we have these conversations together in this space. And sometimes, I'm like more of like a, like a kinetic learner. And so for me, it's like easier to really understand something if I'm able to interact with it and see it happening, or like see that equipment. Other things would include like having a possible hands-on soil classification activity for like high school / college age students to like categorize the soil samples, and then like an in-water sampling table with relevant equipment and tools with description placards to give people more information about everything. And then lastly, having a talk about environmental remediation career pathways. So with some consultants from GSI, the marine sampling contractor, sonic driller and supervisor, and a BIPOC subcontractor. And so these are just some of the activities and ideas that we've been brainstorming in our conversations. And so it's extremely broad, and we'll be narrowing down on specifics as we get closer to the time, but we'd really love it if more people in the space were able to join, if you have the capacity to continue this conversation and make sure that this event is successful and impactful for the community. And so before we open it up for questions from y'all about what we're doing, I just want to drop a few questions in the chat. This is where we're trying to solicit a little bit of feedback from you all. But some of the questions we've got are, what are your recommendations for getting people to the event? What other ideas do folks have for making this a fun and engaging event? And would any community groups who are present here be willing and interested in co-sponsoring this event, like including promoting it across lists, social media, and meetings? Thank you. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Hey, Jessica, I know we just started this agenda item a little late, but just to keep things on the agenda, maybe just give you guys 3 more minutes on this.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks, Ramfis. Mamalong and Elizabeth covered everything perfectly. I don't need to add anything else, except for if folks do have any questions for us or have any recommendations or responses to the questions that Mamalong put in the chat, we would love to hear those. And I'll also put my contact information in the chat if folks are interested in connecting and getting more involved in this organizing effort.
And before we move on to the next agenda item, there are questions coming up in the chat based on the last presentation. So we're going to continue with the next presentation, but we will respond to those questions either after the meeting or in a summary of the meeting that we'll send back out to folks. So they're not getting lost, but Ranfis, move ahead. Okay. I just want to make sure people know we're not losing the questions, but we do want to respect folks' time.
And just to clarify, were there any questions in particular for Jessica T or Mamalong or Elizabeth on this section? We can, unless there aren't any, happy to move along. I did add some questions just within the environmental technician position, just highlighting just the opportunities we have around just highlighting apprentices. I know we have programs that are training people already for OSHA 10, and I think, has the HAZWOPER program as well. And I think just overall, I think, we think of construction, but I know sometimes we talk about remediation as construction and where does sampling and actual construction start, but just a question mark around when prevailing wages are being used or not used on these projects. So happy to take that conversation, offline, just to keep us moving along. But just wanted to note those because I think those are missed opportunities and missed opportunities for folks to be in a career in this space. With that said, now we'll transition into the in-water project updates. So we'll kick it off to Josh Bale with GSI and Barbara with or Barbie with Department of State Lands, and Jessica T again.
Hi, I'll go ahead and get started. I don't think we had the intro slide who was going to lead that, Jessica, but I'll lead this off. So we just wanted to give a quick update on what's going on the in-water group right now. Next slide. So we're going to talk about project updates, Department of State Lands role, the closure of Willamette Cove that'll be done for the purpose of the sampling that's going to come up this summer, and engagement around this closure and communications associated with that. Next slide. So project update, where we're at right now. So we submitted the work plan for the sampling that needs to happen this year, this summer and fall, to EPA on March 18th. And so that's with EPA and the technical coordinating team to start that review, and the Willamette River Advocacy Group technical advisor, who's all reviewing that document. In addition, the EPA has provided a courtesy copy of it to the working group. Any community comments that come in to EPA may be delivered through the technical advisor that's going to be used. And EPA will present the comments or a resolution of those comments and how they're being integrated into the comment response to us on that through the May Willamette Cove Working Group meeting. And the response to comment document and how they pulled that into it. And then sampling activities will start about mid-June for this year. And we've got a series of work. Some of it's going to be during the high water stage as the river stage starts dropping. As you move into the summer, there'll be some work on that transition period. And then as the river goes down, as you get into late summer, the remainder of the work will happen during that time period. Next slide. And then so as a quick refresher, what our objectives are of the sampling that's going to be happening. It supports future in-water remedial design processes. So we're going to start and do our 30% design process late summer, early fall. And so the sampling is really critical to help support us going through the 30% design, or the first major step in the design process. The sampling is to fill data gaps that we had after the 2020 sampling event, and collect data on the riverbank, which we didn't do any collection of that during the 2020 time period. So all this again is in support of the work for the 30% design. And also, tied to that, it's going to continue to evaluate and bound those extents of contamination so that we know any cleanup areas that we have to actively manage, that we fully bounded and we fully understand the extents of those impacts. So again, we're sampling multiple media. There's going to be sediment samples, soil samples, pore water samples, geotechnical samples collected. So there's a variety of different type of samples that will be collected from multiple media. In addition, we're going to be doing some, surveying of the features that are out there, getting a count and location of every pile that's out there, doing biological assessments, things like that. So it is a pretty diverse plan and sampling that we're going to be doing this summer and fall. And then our protocols, again, will use best practices and standard industry approaches for the data collection. These are lined out in a variety of guidance documents that have been developed by EPA and other regulatory agencies over time. And then they'll align with the requirements of the Portland Harbor Superfund site for data collection. Next slide. So we had some comments from the Willamette Cove Working Group related to, this sampling approach and how we're going to address it. So there was concerns in some of these early listening session meetings we had related to habitat that'll be removed in the to remove contamination, and will it result in a hardened, steepened riverbank? So, there's different ways you can approach dealing with removal of contamination and laying back slopes. When you do riverbank cleanup actions, one of those approaches is the more traditional historic approach, the engineered approach. You use hardened materials that make sure that slope's never going to move on you in the future. And that's the classic traditional way things were done. And now there's newer approaches to it that, integrate different philosophies to how you stabilize that bank, because that's still important, but maybe do it without using, riprap up and down the bank or some sort of hardened concrete type of device. So, some of the things we've considered in this is habitat enhancements will absolutely be one of the factors we're going to evaluate during this 30% remedial design process. And then as part of this supplemental investigation that's about ready to happen later this year, we're going to do these biological assessments, as I talked about on the previous slide. And these biological assessments are really important because they help us understand the biological community there, the impacts we may have on the biological communities, and how we mitigate that. So collection of this data really feeds into thinking about how we work with that biological communities as we're moving forward in design. And then, like everything else that we do, EPA will review our design and determine if there's mitigation efforts required. And the other kind of major comment was related to parties considering climate change and integrating those factors. To be really clear, EPA has very clearly laid out in our guidance to how we have to plan for design, that fact that we have to consider climate change into that. And so there's a number of ways that will be done. It'll be done through thinking about, higher river stages at future points in time. It'll be done through this flood rise modeling, that flood conditions and periods of time when flooding happens now may be different than in the future, and changes to climate may affect the biological community, plant communities that may be present in the future. So all these things will be thought about and considered in our 30% design process. Next slide. And I'll pass it over to Barbara with Department of State Lands.
Thank you, Josh. Hi, I'm Barbie Pogue with Department of State Lands. You might be wondering, what does Department of State Lands have to do with all of these projects? And or you may know, but just to go over it again, DSL has a responsibility to uphold the public trust values, to manage state-owned submerged and submersible SNS lands for the benefit of the public, and that includes state-owned riverbeds and riverbanks. And we are required by the Oregon Constitution to manage lands under our jurisdiction with the object of obtaining the greatest benefit for the people of this state, consistent with the conservation of this resource under sound techniques of land management. Next slide, please. So the Department of State Lands in river area closure, we have the authority under OAR 141088 to close state-owned lands to the public when necessary. We are currently pursuing the possibility of a temporary closure of the cove to support the riverbank and the in-water sampling events, of course, and to minimize the safety risk to the boaters and to project personnel, so to the public and to our sampling personnel. We implemented a similar closure in late summer and fall of 2020. Next slide, please. And the process, it's complicated for me, but it should be easy for all of you. We are required to provide a heads up to community members that public notice is coming soon. And DSL has published in the Oregonian today a notice of the public notice, if you will. By law, we have to let that go through publications for 1 week to let the public know a 30-day public comment period is coming up, so that that's not a surprise. So that should be in there today. I got something emailed to me, but I haven't had time to really look for it. It will stay there for 1 week. And then we will initiate that 30-day public comment period, excuse me. So that will run April 5th to May 5th. So we'll publish the second item there, the potential closure notice, and we'll invite those public comments through mainstream and community media outlets, our DSL stakeholder list, community contacts, and businesses. And our DSL media folks are working, especially with Jessica, and they have many lists of contacts and methods of getting the word out that this public comment period is open. We can only accept comments during that 30-day period. However, if I get something before that, I will go back to the commenter and say, please resubmit this at this time. After the comment period closes, I won't be allowed to do that. So it's just really important that if somebody wants to comment, they recognize it is a 30-day window. So at the conclusion then of the 30-day public comment period, all of those comments are coming directly to me via email, and I will respond to every one of them personally and with DSL support. So hopefully I don't get hundreds of comments. In 2020, we just really had a handful of comments. So I'm hoping in that we've done this 2 years ago, it won't come as maybe such a great surprise to the community members and concerned folks. Hoping, to just have some mainstream comments and not an overflow, but whatever I get, I'll deal with it as it comes, right? So I'm also, I plan on consolidating all of the comments and then, in a tabulated form, and then our DSL response to all of those comments. And Ranfis, you had initially brought this up, where can the public see how comments were addressed by DSL. I don't think this was done in 2020, and I really want to improve upon that. And I think I totally agree that needs to be accessible to the public. So we're just talking about it now, but at a minimum, we will publish that on our webpage. And I'm trying to think of other ways to get that out to community members. So if anybody has good ideas, please let me know. And I mean, we literally are just talking about this today with our in-water team. So I'm pretty confident we'll come up with other ways, but feel free to join in and give suggestions. Okay, so after consideration of comments, you know, then we need to come up with a conclusion. Are we going to pursue this closure? It's still very tentative. And in 2020, we incorporated quite a bit of those comments into how that closure was going to be accomplished. So we will probably see that again this year, and that's great because it really improves upon our processes. So if we are going to go ahead with the closure, then by rule we have 4 weeks to where we have to again post notice that this closure is coming, and again get the word out to everybody. Okay, you know, we had our public comment period, and then we say we have come to the conclusion we're going to pursue the closure. Now we have 4 weeks to let everybody know it will be closed during this time period. That's only fair, right? So that's kind of that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line item there. Again, working with the city, working with my media folks to get that information out. Then the closure occurs. And the whole time, you know, I'll be circling back with this group, with my other Willamette Cove groups. I'm on the executive committee. It'll be kind of a, you know, constant back and forth communication as kind of written out there. At the end of the closure period, then again, we post notice the closure period has ended. So there's a lot of work for DSL in terms of getting out those email blasts, getting those postings in the Oregonian and other publications. But we don't want this to come as a surprise to anybody. And we really want that input, you know, so that if we are going to close the cove, it's with the, you know, the best insight and information available. And hopefully everybody's on board. That's what we're going for. So next slide.
And just a quick note here, Barbie, we have just 4 minutes left on this agenda item.
I'm done talking. I talk fast.
So thank you, Barbie, for all of that. I think one of the things I wanted to highlight here when we talked about what we actually had, sorry, getting chats at the same time talking, I feel a little distracted. So a couple of the things that we wound up doing based on the feedback that was received by DSL from community members, both, you know, formal public comment, but then also whenever we did a presentation to community members as part of the working group a couple of years ago, we heard a few different things from y'all and from the community members who participated at that time. And so those are listed here. And you know, so we're going to continue to do these different pieces. So one is we have our team, if folks haven't participated yet in a trauma-informed care training, they are going to do so. There's a training that Trauma-Informed Oregon has provided that's online that we have our whole team participating in. It was also encouraged that we take a non-enforcement approach. And I think that's very much aligns with the trauma-informed approach. So really making sure that if there are folks in an area after the closure has gone into effect, is that we're actually talking to those folks, letting them know what's going on, encouraging them to move out of the area, as well as providing information on the closure in advance. So a couple of years ago, y'all may remember Richard Fitzgerald. He and I went out to do some kayak outreach to the boats that were then in that area weeks in advance. To let them know, you know, kind of what was coming down the pike and to share the information that they needed. And so we're planning on doing that again this year. And We'll continue to do the direct engagement, both with community organizations, community papers. So Barbie had mentioned, the notice coming out in the Oregonian. DSL also worked really diligently to make sure that that information got out to a variety of community-based newspapers, including Street Roots, Hey Neighbor, and others within the city, to get that word out as broadly as we possibly could. The other piece is that we'll be making this information available online, so folks can access the information, know how to provide public comment. I will say too, so everyone within this space should have received an email yesterday afternoon that said that, hey, it was the heads up that this is coming down the pike. Whenever the public comment period goes live, we will also send another email that has that information. And there'll also be a communications package that's coming out. So it'll be an opportunity for folks to continue to share that with their respective networks. Next slide. I know we're running short on time, but we had updated this flyer that we had created last year based on community feedback. And basically it includes just sort of like the who, what, when, where, why this is all happening, who to contact with information. It has if folks need translation services, that's also. So we'd love to get feedback from folks if folks have more time. We can talk a little bit more about that if you have more feedback to share as we're working to share this information out. I'd be happy to talk more with folks. And then finally, if you'll go to the next slide, Alyssa, we'd really love your help in getting the word out, sharing information through your social media networks, sharing the flyer, modifying if the stock email that we have to help people understand that this is coming down the pike, to let them know there's opportunities for public comment, and then if the closure goes into effect, to help spread that word as well. So we're wondering if we can count on folks within this space to share this information with your networks, and also just what your sort of overall thoughts are on how we're approaching this, and if you have any other recommendations or feedback for us that we should be taking into account and putting into practice as we're working to spread the word about the comment period, and then what happens next.
Thanks, Jessica, Barbie, and for this. Any comments or questions? I see Cassie, your hands raised on this.
Just wondering who specifically is doing the outreach to the folks in the boats and this is, you're talking about the closure of the water.
Correct. Yes. Thank you for that clarification, Cassie. We're talking about the closure of the water because, as we already know, the Upland area is closed to the public. So we're talking about a closure of the area in the water. And so Kyle Haggart and I are planning on going out. And Elizabeth, I see you raising your head and probably going out and doing some outreach on the boats. There's currently just one boat there. So we wound up several times actually not last summer, 2 summers ago.
And there was one other question in the chat about the in-water sampling and whether or not we're sampling fish and fish tissues.
Yeah, I saw that. So there's been past sampling done for the RIFS throughout Portland Harbor. That's not specifically part of the supplemental investigation. We're going to rely on the previous data that's been collected in support of that. However, to be clear, as part of the long-term monitoring, remedial action objective monitoring, typically fish biota and other types of biota sampling is done as part of that kind of post remedy monitoring, 5-year monitoring type of work. So that I would expect that would be part of the future work, but not for the active sampling. It really won't change how we approach how we're looking at designing the remedy.
Thanks, Josh. Any other questions?
One thing I did just want to add is that we had listed in there about EPA coming back to do a presentation in May about the comments. So some of that timeline may be a little bit fuzzy, just wanted to put that out there. So it may not exactly be May, it might be June. So some of it's going to depend on comments received and EPA's ability to respond to those. So I wanted to just put that out there as well, and appreciate Lauren in reaching out to me via chat to make that correction. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess Barbie and team, I think I guess we'll be sharing a link to be able to submit that comment via email, so folks will have a chance to respond and share this social media. Does Department of State Lands, do you all have social media or things that we could be able to link onto?
We're not the best at social media, being a state agency, I'll say. But we do have some. So Allie Hansen is one of the media folks I'm working with at DSL, and then Leanne O'Neill. And they worked with the closure 2 years ago, and they worked with Jessica. So those, my triumvirate, they have it all going on, and I am totally relying on them because they're amazing to get the word out. So Jessica can probably answer that better than I can.
Yeah, no problem. So what we had done before is we actually had a whole communications packet that we shared, sent it out to everyone, community members and news outlets via email, and then also we had it on our respective socials. So all of that we will absolutely be sharing with you all as we have it.
Perfect. Well, as a community member, happy to uplift and happy to work on a coalition letter if other community groups are interested in submitting a coalition letter here on the comments. And I just appreciate you all just sharing at least some list of examples of how you've incorporated public feedback. I'm going to move us along at 6 o'clock. You know, we're going to want to quickly just highlight some next steps and adjourn here. Anything folks want to flag for next steps before we adjourn?
I would just like to make a plug for reminding folks about the opportunity to participate in the executive committee, and also the technician position. So I'm going to put both of those descriptions back in the chat, so they're kind of top for folks. And if people have questions about any of that, I think they can reach out and we can help you with that.
Thank you for the reminder. I also want to do a quick plug. It is budget season, so I do want to flag, you know, community groups and advocacy. You know, I think it's a good time to start tracking particular budgets. I know for the state legislature just ended earlier in the month, so love to sort of get some community members together just to sort of review what's coming up, and hopefully we can get an update from some of our public parties about in our next meeting, just what's being budgeted related to the super fund, both inland and upland. So I will definitely be following that up and providing that invitation in the email notes. Any other next steps before we adjourn?
So Ranfees and I were talking before this meeting. He brought up the budget thing. Would people like to get like a port budget 101 overview?
Budget, the real numbers of like before of what's being proposed before a budget is adopted even would be good each cycle, from all of the agencies, including Metro. That's related to Portland Harbor or Willamette Cove Upland site.
So maybe there's something around how do you fund super fund from each of the different agencies?
Yeah.
It might take a little bit to figure that out, but I think we could put something like that together.
Perfect. Thank you. It's 6:02. We've had some folks begin to drop off. I just want to appreciate everyone for joining us and asking some key questions. Hopefully we'll follow up on some next steps, especially for some conversations that I don't think those threads were completely over, but thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and hopefully we'll connect again for our next meeting.